She says we don't have any first-hand accounts to verify the crucifixion. And yet she will follow a book, the Quran, which she thinks came through Muhammad, that was composed in the 7th century. So she will reject earlier sources about the historicity of the crucifixion for a source that she thinks comes from the 7th century, 600s, through a man named Muhammad who was not there in the 1st century, never met any of the eyewitnesses to Christ, never interviewed them. And that assumption is based on sources that come over 100 years after Muhammad. Now, let me explain what I mean. If I were to ask Cora or Labiano, how do you know the Quran, as you have it today, existed in the 7th century? How do you know that Muhammad, the name appears only 4 times in the Quran, refers to the Muhammad you believe in, whom you believe was born in 570 AD and ministered for 23 years? How do you know what the Quran even is when the Quran doesn't tell you what the Quran is, how many chapters make up the Quran, where the Quran was composed, and when? Do you get it? You understand what she just did to her position? Because they're not interested in truth. They're not interested in consistency. They're not interested in honesty. They just want to bash Christianity, but they have nothing to offer. They cannot present to you Muhammad as a model when you know Jesus and his example, or even follow the example of Paul. But you understand this argument? You see what she did, right? Now, if she tells you, well, Muhammad doesn't need to be an eyewitness or meet the eyewitnesses, Allah inspired him. So hold on. You're saying your God can only inspire a man whom you believe came in the 7th century, right? Whom you believe is the one who recited the Quran as you have it, in a language completely unknown, not spoken by Jesus or his followers. He could do that for him 600 years later, but he can't do it for people writing only 30 to 60 years later. You see what I'm doing with this argument? So God can't do for the first 2 generations in the lifetime of Christ what he did for a man 600 years later, assuming your narrative, who spoke in a language not spoken of by Christ or his followers. Do you understand what I just did? If you understand how to use this argument? All right. The assumption is that only an eyewitness can write an accurate report of events. If that assumption is true, then she just destroyed her hadiths and seerah. Why? The oldest extant seerah, biography on Muhammad, is written 100 years after Muhammad. That's if we go with the traditional narrative. Now look at how many holes. I have to believe Ibn Hisham wrote Sirat Rasulullah around 750 AD. But where do I get that from? I don't get it from any contemporary sources, inscriptions, writings in the 8th century. I'm dependent on sources that come over 200 years later, telling me there was a man named Ibn Ishaq who wrote a biography in the 8th century. See how bad it is for them? Are you understanding how to use this argument? Okay. So, but I'll be generous and I'll say, all right, I will accept what your sources that come over 200 years later tell me about what Ibn Ishaq did, right? About 100 years after the death of your prophet. But even if I go with that, Ibn Ishaq wrote 750 AD. If you're telling me you need an eyewitness account, a first-hand account, Ibn Ishaq was not an eyewitness to your prophet, and he's not a first-hand account. Does that mean you now destroy Islam? Now you're going to go back and become a skeptic and now embrace the views of J. Smith and Robert Spencer and question the whole narrative about Muhammad and question whether even Muhammad existed? Or are you going to assume, like any real historian does, that you can have a person interviewing eyewitnesses or interviewing the followers of eyewitnesses or consulting sources written by eyewitnesses earlier than him to give you an accurate historical narrative? You get it? If we follow what she says, then that means any work written long after the person and his followers have died cannot be trusted. This level of skepticism destroys not just Islam, but any and every historical writing that wasn't written by a contemporary. And now you become complete skeptics of the entire ancient history. So now you're going to have to question whether Jesus existed, let alone, right, the crucifixion. Do you understand how bad it is? This approach to Christianity will end up causing her to then question not just crucifixion, whether Jesus existed. You have scholars like Robert Price, not James Price, and Richard Carrier, who say Jesus did not exist. They even question whether Paul existed, and they even question whether Ignatius existed. You see the problem now? Therefore, she now ends up following a path that means Islam is false, because by the same historical method, you can't even prove Muhammad existed. And then even if you can demonstrate Muhammad existed, you have no proof that Jesus existed, which means Islam is false because it says Jesus did. Do you understand the problem? Do you guys understand the problem? Everyone got the problem with this approach? Which leads me to the following questions. How could someone in the 7th century confirm that what Muhammad said about Jesus is historical? You see what she just did? What do I mean? Understand this argument. How does she know Jesus' mother's name is Maryam? Well, the Quran says it. Well, how can we trust the Quran? Oh, because the Christian sources. But you just destroyed the Christian sources. You understand what I just did here? How do you know when Jesus lived, where he lived, and how do you know anything about anything he preached and said? And how do you know why he was opposed? And how do you know that someone else died in his place? If you question the sources that are closest to the time of Christ, because you can't pick and choose, because that's circular reasoning. That's begging the question. That's putting the cart before the horse. In other words, I only know that this is true because it agrees with the Quran. But the Quran is what we're questioning. You can't tell me, well, you know, that part about Maryam being her name is right because the Quran says so. No, we want to know, how do you know he had a mother named Mary? See what I'm doing here? In point of fact, even the name Isa, there is no, right, good, solid historical evidence that suggests that was his name. Jesus' Hebrew name would have been Yeshua, Arabic, Yeshua. Where did you get Isa? And how do you know that Isa is the appropriate form of his Hebrew name? In point of fact, how do you even know what his name is? How do you know he was called Jesus? How do you know any of this? And then when the Quran tells you his followers were Muslims, who were his followers? How many? Where did they go? What did they preach? What century did they preach? You with me there? Where did they go? Who did they go to? What century did they preach? If you tell me first century, how do you know that? Oh, from the Christian documents. But you just called those documents into question. Why? Because you said they're not first-hand accounts. So if they're not first-hand accounts and you can't trust them when it comes to the crucifixion, how do you know you can trust them when they situate Jesus in the first century in Galilee? How do you know you can trust them in telling you the name of his followers? You see what you just did to the Quran? This is how you attack this argument. You understand what you just did to the Quran, if you're listening? Once they question the documents because of the crucifixion, they cannot believe anything about Jesus anymore. Because they'll tell you, well, his name is Jesus. How do you know that? Quran says so, but how do you know the Quran is right? Because even the form of name given to him doesn't correspond to the Arabic form. Well, because of Christian sources. What sources? What century? His mother's name is Maryam. How do you know? How do you know her name was Maryam? Not only that, the Quran says he had followers. How many? Who were they? And where did they minister? In fact, what century did Jesus preach? Are you understanding my questions? But contrary to our assertion, even historians who are not Christians, who don't think that the New Testament writings are completely reliable and think that some of the books are forgeries, they all will appeal to the letters of Paul and the Gospels because even skeptical scholars date the Gospels in the first century. For instance, liberal critical dating of the Gospels. They'll say Mark is written between 65, 70 AD. Matthew, Luke, and Acts between 70, 80 AD. John, 90, 100 AD. But these scholars say that these documents are based on earlier sources, both written and oral, so that the material they contain go back to an earlier period. So that means when they want to reconstruct the life of Jesus, they look to the four Gospels, Acts, and the letters of Paul, particularly 1 Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, right? Philippians. Now, you know why that's important? I'm going to quote an evangelical conservative scholar and a skeptical scholar named James D.G. Junn on the dating of 1 Corinthians and its implication. Okay. You ready? Gary Habermas, as well as Galatians. Gary Habermas, I want you to listen, is one of the world's leading scholars and historians on near-death experiences, Shroud of Turin, and historical evidence of Jesus. He's writing multiple books, thousands of pages, on all the historical data, facts, and scholars that affirm Christ was killed as a fact of history, was buried in a tomb. A group of his women followers discovered the tomb empty, and his followers claimed to have seen him alive in the flesh, glorified, and ascended to heaven. The first volume has already come out. Massive tome. Now let me get you his YouTube channel. He's approaching it as an historian, not as a Bible-believing Christian. Him and Mike Lacona have done the best work on the historical evidence for the resurrection and the existence of Christ. They debate skeptics, you name it. Mike Lacona has debated Bart Ehrman several times and Shibrali. The last debate he had with Shibrali, he schooled them. So here it is. So I'm going to show you what he says about the dating of Galatians, the dating of 1 Corinthians by even skeptical historians. Watch his sessions on the evidence for the resurrection and the data used by skeptical historians. Here, for example, super early historical data for the resurrection of Jesus. And he's calling from the data of skeptical historians, facts they admit due to the evidence. Okay, it's all here. Historical facts, right here. Go watch his lecture, an hour lecture. Here. Gary Habermas, to everyone an answer. A case for the Christian worldview. Pages 183, 186. He begins the evidence for the historicity of the resurrection. Beyond Paul's own experience, this apostle presents plenty of additional evidence for the claim that Jesus had appeared to his early followers. Essentially, all critical scholars today agree. Notice, essentially all critical scholars, did you hear that, Cora Tammy? Not simply Christians who believe in Jesus. All critical scholars believe 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3 and 8, Paul records an ancient oral tradition. Did you know that? Even Bart Ehrman agrees with the consensus. What Paul has done, he's taken an oral tradition that was committed to memory, taught by the apostles, so that Christians would memorize this formula, attesting to the evidence for the resurrection. According to scholars, who came up with that formula? The apostles. Who then put it to rhyme? The apostles. Why did they do that? To make it easier for you to memorize. It's like the Apostles' Creed. You get my point? Like the Apostles' Creed? It's easy to memorize. So scholars believe that what you have in 1 Corinthians 15 through 8 is something like the Apostles' Creed put into lines to facilitate memorization. And this was composed before Paul converted. Okay? Because it reads like a rabbinic method of passing on information that's important to make it easier for disciples to memorize. Okay, what they're saying here? Because the rabbis had certain techniques, ways to help their students to memorize material that they deemed to be important. So the evidence shows that there's a structure. And this structure shows that this was something composed so you could then memorize it. And Paul was simply including it. Paul records an ancient oral tradition that summarizes the content of the Christian gospel. Jesus the Christ died for human sin, was buried and raised from dead, afterwards appearing to both individuals as well as the groups of witnesses. While Paul penned the words, he is clear that this material was not his own, but that he has passed on to his listeners years before. What he had received from other, right? I believe it's supposed to say others. So as the very heart of his message, if you were writing today, he might have footnoted his source. Thus, this testimony is actually years earlier than the book of 1 Corinthians. Reginald Fuller indicates the scholarly agreement, real scholars of history. It is almost universally agreed today that Paul is here citing tradition. Guess how old this tradition is according to the scholars. Here you go. The most popular view among scholars is that Paul first received this very early material when he visited Jerusalem just 3 years after his conversion. Understand the implication. If Paul was taught this 3 years after his conversion, and Paul converted to Christianity 3 years after Christ's resurrection, that means the apostles were already teaching this within a few years of Jesus' resurrection, because Paul would have been taught something already composed and passed on by the apostles. So let's say he converted 3 years after Christ's resurrection. He learned this 3 years later. That means less than 6 years of Jesus' resurrection, the apostles were teaching this oral tradition. You catch it? This is an oral tradition that would have been composed less than 6 years, quite early. In fact, some people say within a year of Jesus' resurrection. And she says there's no first-hand account. What are you talking about? According to what scholarship? Let me read here, though. So Paul provides a straightforward explanation that he delivered to his audience what he had first received from others, which are the equivalent terms for passing rabbinic tradition to others. That's how the rabbis would teach. Besides this clear declaration of his actions, there are many other indications that this is exactly what happened. the sentence structure, diction, verbal parallelism, the way it's structured, the threefold sequence of and that, as well as the presence of several non-Pauline words, meaning this material contains words not found in other letters of Paul. So it doesn't come from Paul. These words would have come from the tradition that Paul adopted. The proper names of Cephas. The tradition mentions Peter's Aramaic name. You know why that's important? And James. And indications that there may have been an Aramaic original all point clearly to this tradition being pre-Pauline. Critical scholars agree that Paul received it from others. You understand the implication? The fact that Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, Christ appeared to Cephas, that's the Greek transliteration of Kepha, means that this was in Aramaic, because in Aramaic, they would have referred to Kepha, not Peter, because Peter is Greek. Do you understand what he's saying here, right? The word for rock, the name of Peter, in Greek is Petros. It's only in Greek that they would have called them Kepha. Kepha is Aramaic for rock. The fact that the tradition says that Christ appeared to Cephas, which is the Greek transliteration of Kepha, means this was composed in Aramaic by Aramaic-speaking Jews. But where did they worship Jesus in Aramaic? In Jerusalem. See the evidence? See that? Because if you're going to make it up, you're going to say Petros, Greek. To Greeks, you don't say Kepha. Kepha is Aramaic. You're going to say the Greek for rock, Petros. But no, it has Kepha. 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 We still use that to this day. You guys understand why scholars are amazed at this? They say, wow, this is a tradition that's very early. How early? He learned it when he went up to visit them. When did he visit Peter, James, and John? 3 years after his conversion. So that means they had already formulated this years earlier among the Aramaic-speaking Jews. He visited Peter and James, right? The brother of Jesus, both of whom are listed as having seen the risen Jesus. Okay, now watch. Stronger evidence to support this conclusion comes from Paul's use of the verb historise in Galatians 1:18. I'm going to go there and show you what he means, which is usually not very helpfully translated into English. The Greek term indicates that Paul visited Peter for the purpose of investigating a particular subject. The immediate context reveals the subject. Paul's topic for discussion was ascertaining the nature of the gospel message. Why did he go up to meet Peter, James, in Jerusalem? To make sure that what he saw and what he heard from Christ agrees with the message that the very eyewitnesses to Christ when he was on earth received. And Jesus' resurrection was the focus of the gospel message. Without it, faith is in vain. What is the word he used? I'm going to show you the Greek in a minute. Historise. Historise. Right? Critical scholars. What does critical scholar means? Liberals who don't believe the Bible is inspired. Critical scholars. Liberals. Let me get a drink. Watch. So you can thank Cora for this session, revisiting the evidence I've discussed in the past. Okay. Creature repetition, right? We need to hear something repetitively. All right. Usually concede that this Pauline tradition originated at an exceptionally early date. For Ulrich Wilkins, this content indubitably goes back to the oldest phase of all in the history of primitive Christianity. What is she talking about? That there is no first-hand account. Walter Casper even thinks this ancient text was possibly in use by the end of 30 AD. What is she talking about? What is she talking about? Surprisingly, skeptics frequently even agree. Skeptic Gurad Luraman, by the way, he's an atheist. He debated William Lane Craig. And as an historian, though an atheist, look what he admits. Asserts, quote, that the elements and the traditions are to be dated to the first 2 years after the crucifixion of Jesus, not later than 3 years. An atheist historian on the resurrection says this material that Paul quoted was composed no later than 3 years after Jesus' resurrection. No first-hand account? Did you understand the evidence for your faith? When you have atheist historians acknowledging how early the proclamation by the eyewitnesses of Christ happens to be that he's risen, it's over. The formation of the appearance traditions mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 falls into the time between 30 and 33 CE. Philosopher Thomas Sheehan thinks that this pre-Pauline formula probably goes back to at least 32, 34 Christian era. You see how short the interval? That is to within 2 to 4 years of the crucifixion. Michael Goulder, and by the way, these are all liberals, skeptics who don't believe in the resurrection. Yep. And he's an atheist. Grad Luruman. In the beginning, God bless you, brother. Okay. So Michael Goulder holds that this resurrection goes back at least to what Paul was taught when he's converted a couple years after crucifixion. Other skeptics are often not shy about expressing their agreement. In fact, most of the critical scholars who date these events conclude that Paul received this material within just a few years after Jesus' death in the early or mid-30s. We will see how the existence and circumstances at such an early date translate to additional eyewitness testimony besides Paul's. Now, let me go through the quotations here. It's lengthy, but bear with me, right? And I'm going to show you what he's quoting. Paul was exceptionally careful to ascertain the content of the gospel message, meaning he wasn't a blind follower. He made sure to confirm that what he received from Christ was what Jesus taught his followers when Jesus was with them on earth. And then he did it 14 years later. Did you know that? Paul twice, right? Paul twice went to confirm that he was receiving revelation from Jesus from the living eyewitnesses of Jesus. Twice. When he got converted and 14 years after. That's Galatians 2. Which centered on the resurrection. To do so, he made a second trip to Jerusalem specifically for the purpose of checking out his gospel preaching. Amazingly, he states his fear that perhaps he had been teaching the wrong message. Just in case, maybe I dropped the ball, I've fallen away like so many. God forbid. May the same Holy Spirit that fills Paul, who's alive and glorified with Jesus, fill us to love Jesus, finish the race, forgiven. Okay, some think that Acts 15, 1-35 describes an amazing third trip to Jerusalem to do the same. Paul obviously desired to be absolutely positive of the gospel truth. See? He didn't want to be deceived and deceive others. He didn't want to deceive and be deceived. He wanted to make sure that he preached the truth, and these are facts. So he would go to the eyewitnesses who walked with Jesus on earth. Now watch. Paul obviously desired to be absolutely positive of the gospel truth. Further, right? Paul was careful to ask his questions of the proper authorities, the chief apostles. In his initial trip, he made with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. On the second occasion, he met with these same two men, plus the apostle John. Martin Hengel points out that evidently the tradition of 1 Corinthians 15:3 had been subjected to many tests by Paul to make sure it was absolutely factual, right? It is easy to overlook the significance of these meetings. Look, the four men who met together on the latter occasion were certainly the chief apostles in the early church, and each one had been an eyewitness of Jesus' resurrection appearances. Therefore, when Paul received their confirmation from Peter, James, and John, that his gospel is correct, we have their assurance that Paul's message of Jesus' resurrection appearances agreed with their own experiences. Certainly, if they thought that Paul erred on the central fact of the gospel, this would have created great problems, especially given the apostolic concern to ensure doctrinal truth in the early church. Now, please follow the argument, because I'm going to show you the verses they're referring to. So Paul provides more than his own eyewitness testimony, as in one above. During his trips to inquire of the 3 senior apostles in Jerusalem, Paul passed their examination. Peter, James, and John said, Paul, you've been preaching the right gospel, same gospel received, taught by Jesus when he was on earth, and he was in the flesh with us. And she's saying there's no first-hand account.